Thank you to our speakers. So does anybody have any questions to the speakers to start the conversation? Yes. Please remember to speak into the mic.
Hi, I'm Mona Hicks with One Mind. So I think these two talks were great introductions, and I see them as kind of flip sides of the coin, because I used to be at NIH, and one of the things that was going on when I was there was the sense that the clinical trials were collecting way too much unnecessary data, and it was causing a lot of expense. And they went to this concept of the small, simple trial, which is, figure out what you need, get that, and move on. It's totally different now, I think, in terms of concept, because I think with the idea, I think what we've learned is there's a lot of stuff, you don't necessarily know you need it sort of until after you don't have it. So I think that's what, so where do we go from here? Because it is expensive to collect a lot of data, but if you have kind of a bare bones approach, it's really hard to do like subtyping and figure out, why did this thing work in some people and not others? You're just like, oh, it would have been great if we had, biospecimens or something else. So how do we balance that, I guess, is the question.
So, that's a fascinating and unanswerable question, right? I've worked in labs that have run clinical trials, and there's just the freezer farms of samples for the what if tomorrows, right? Because you do try to protect against information or knowledge we get in the future that we don't have at the time that we're necessarily making those decisions. And I think the same is true certainly on the data side. We gather all sorts of data, and then, I don't know that I think about it so much in terms of data collection, but I definitely think about it in terms of data management and sharing. Which portions of this data are maximally useful to share given the known cost of doing so, right? And so how do we, and I think that's a real issue that, depending on who you are and what your goal is, comes out, right? So the funders certainly want to see data sharing so that they can improve the transparency and the primary analyses used on the data, right? And that is universally true for every data set equally, right? But then if you want to think about secondary use, not all data sets are as amenable to secondary use. Or if you're trying to build a common resource for many people to use, right, you might think about those things differently, and you might make different choices about what data you collect and share. So I think that's probably a long way of saying, I don't know.
So it depends.
Right, and I would see the natural evolution of that is going to reuse. And I think someone responsible, I would hope, would say, we used to see those kind of big bloated trials, and when I was running trials, there would be all sorts of people kind of piggybacking onto my trial, let's just collect 10 more samples for pharmacogenomics, and right, and then it would become this big bloated thing, and so many more time points, so many more biospecimens collected onto the initial trial. And now maybe you're saying we have a more simplified, streamlined trial. But, I would love to see the day where someone's planning a trial and saying, wait a minute, did someone already conduct a similar trial and ask a similar question? And let me go back and look. I know that's not nearly as glamorous as conducting that trial by yourself, again, and being the PI, but maybe that's the responsible thing to do for participants. So hopefully that day will come sometime soon.
So Rebecca, so it sounds like you're sort of arguing for sort of just an inventory of clinical trials, but don't we have that with clinicaltrials.gov?
So certainly for clinicaltrials.gov, that is for disclosure, right? So right now you can look if someone has conducted a Alzheimer's or epilepsy or muscular dystrophy trial in a particular with these eligibility criteria, and that contains the summary data, right? But it does not contain the raw data, the individual participant level data within clinicaltrials.gov, and that's what our platform contains. Is the IPD, the individual participant level data, which you can only do certain types of analysis on, is if you have the raw data that emanates out of that, not just the summary level statistics.
Well, just to make my point clear, so I'm not really arguing for the large simple trial. I think that for a lot of science, and especially neuroscience, we really still don't understand enough about the disorder. So that's part of the reason so many of these neuroscience clinical trials have failed. So I'm actually sort of arguing more on the large observational studies to get that natural history, and also the subtyping and biomarkers and comparative effectiveness research, which I think is, I've thought a lot about like clinical trials, and it just feels like an impossible thing to do RCTs on every possible dose and therapy and patient subtypes. So I feel like there almost has to be another approach. Some of it will come through statistics, but I think a lot of it could come out of this population-based type data, or richer things that are piggybacked onto clinical trials, but at the same time being mindful that, there is limits as well.
Yeah, I would totally agree. I mean, there have been efforts, at least for FIVLI, to compare all the control arms of all these trials. For example, we have many, many Alzheimer's trials, so there are people like looking at the control arms and trying to compare them, for example, or other neuromuscular diseases. So I think that's one start. Even to plan your observational trial, I think that's a good start, to start thinking about how to plan registries and observational trials to get a grant, or for example.
I have a comment on that point as well. I mean, I think there are different ways we can do trials now rather than RCTs. I mean, at Current Veterans Bioscience, we're planning a phase 2 adaptive platform trial. So this is really enables us to look at multiple interventions in a disease more perpetually. And the benefit there is, although we're looking at a specific question, like do we see an effect size with this treatment, we can also collect biosamples to do some retrospective discovery and answer some of those questions like subtyping and so on as we go.
I have a question, Silvana Borges from FDA. For Rebecca, how difficult was it, or is it, to get the industry, pharmaceutical companies, to share their clinical data? I mean, I know of some public-private partnerships that aim at the same goals that have had several hiccups on getting there.
So I would say it hasn't always been easy. We do have a harmonized data use agreement, and I would say that was probably one of the more difficult pathways, given the diversity of our stakeholders, to have a single data use agreement that we all have agreed upon, and all the legal departments from all of our stakeholders have agreed to utilize. Because that was kind of a singular achievement before we launched, to have all of the parties agree to a single harmonized data use agreement. That in of itself was a little bit of a lift.
Maybe I can comment on that too. I'm Mike Egan from Merck. So I think there has been a movement in the industry to try to share more data, and that takes several different forms. So for some companies, they'll give academics access to the data sets to actually analyze the data. I know Lilly's done that with some of their trials. And for other companies, you can go to a web portal and submit data requests or specific analysis plans. So I think there is a movement to try to be more open about that. I would note, just a couple other notes. For any registered drug, the FDA has the raw data. So it's a huge repository, and I suspect it's really not that well utilized. They probably don't have the resources, but it would be nice to imagine a future where academics could submit queries, and if the FDA statistician approves that, if they were funded, maybe they could run it internally and give the results. I'm sure there are issues with it. But that's one idea. I guess I'll stop there.
Yeah, so I mean, that's essentially what we're doing. I mean, I don't know if the FDA would ever allow that because, of course, the FDA also has all of the raw data that is submitted for regulatory submission. But, so that is what we receive is the data that comes in for after a regulatory decision. Sometimes we receive data from terminated drugs. So that is kind of the data that flows into FIVLI. Certainly if that would be huge if the FDA or EMA made those databases open to query. But to date, that has not been something that we've heard about at least.
Just
I wanted to comment. I wanted to comment on Ramona's point about simplification of these large clinical trials. So by default, we tend to collect so much data as we're executing the large clinical prospective trial. And do we have a duty to curate those data for future analyses, whether it's the thin imaging data that we collect just as a part of inclusion criteria and then they're thrown away, or the waveform analytics from multiparametric data from Dick Moberg's group. But I think that part of us, I feel a duty to curate these data for future analyses because they are a resource that we've been given. And they can certainly inform subgroup analyses in the future. But how do we provide resources to be able to identify those imaging biomarkers, those other covariates that are buried as byproducts of execution of maybe this first analysis?
I think NIH just put out some funding, which is really cool because I think what you're getting at is a big problem, and it probably gets to part of what you were saying too, Rebecca, about it's an underutilized resource because people are like, well, we're not just sitting around here, looking for work, and actually making good use of that data takes a lot of time. There's a lot of work involved. So I think, that's encouraging, and I don't know I'm not exactly sure what our task of this is, but I think, if people in this group sort of endorse the concept of trying to get reuse of these large, expensive studies, I mean, maybe that goes without saying, I don't know, but. And then providing resources, acknowledging that there needs to be resources, which I do feel at least the NIH is getting, and I think the Department of Defense too has had some initiatives or some funding announcements like this. So maybe just keep promoting that and then showing what it delivers. I mean, if we can get some really good examples of stuff that's come out of secondary analysis, that'll keep driving the momentum forward.
Right. I don't feel like everyone is like you that believes that they have a responsibility to curate their data. I would love that, and I'd love to have that as a quote, but I feel like not everyone feels like they have a responsibility to curate their data for the next person or even for their future self to enable reuse of their own data.
I think if you're tasked with generating ultimately a public use data set from a national clinical trial, then without being able to format those data in a way that other people can understand or make use of them, you're lost. Yet the resources to do that usually aren't in the upfront grant support. So contributing resources to develop a platform when you have these prospective curated data that will include imaging or serum biomarkers or multiparametric monitoring for the population, so that they are curated in a standardized fashion that then can result in an open access platform or at least in an accessible platform for additional analyses, I think is an important target. And you're right, they did just release a pre-RFA. Yes.
I want to follow up on the idea of FDA sharing the data, and I agree that we sit on a wealth of clinical trial data that by far most of the data is not the FDA's data, so it's proprietary data. And even when we have done analysis internally, we have published as well. But even for that exercise, even when we anonymize the drugs themselves, we need to ask for permission or consent from the companies. So I think that this is, but I agree. From when I remove my FDA hat and I put my scientist hat, I agree that it's a great resource, but it would take more than the FDA willing to engage in that kind of conversation. So that would have to be a concerted effort of the scientific community, including the owners of the data, which are for the most part the company. So I see, some light here at the end of the path that maybe there's a shift in that now the value of sharing is contemplated more now. And I also had a comment or another question related to, you mentioned that the uptake or the utilization of the data has not been as great as you would have expected. So does harmonization of the data have to do with it, or how do you deal with that since the data are coming from different sources, and I guess harmonization may be an issue?
Right. So we really struggled with, when we launched last year, whether to require a data standard. So whether to require SDTM, for example. And in the end, we decided to recommend that data come in a data standard. But as we probably know, even industry data, as required by FDA, likely flows in standardized. But that's like even before a certain year, we have data that's fairly old, and that data is not even standardized. So we would be missing out on some very valuable legacy data if we said, we only require data that's in CDISC standards. We also would be really blocking out virtually every academic data set, not all, but many of the very valuable data sets from academia. And we just felt like at this stage in our growth, that would not be a strategic decision. However, on the flip side, it does make those that are submitting requests, and once they get data, they go through a process that they submit a scientific proposal. This is what we want. Once they get the data and it hits them in the research environment, it is difficult for them, as you can imagine, to actually conduct their analysis. So if they're getting 3 data sets from industry and few from academia, then it is more difficult. It's a much bigger lift for them to actually conduct their analysis. It doesn't mean that they wish they didn't get the data, but it is a lift for them to actually conduct their analysis. I'm hoping that at some point we could partner with someone that has, machine learning, or there's some kind of algorithm that we can move that and make that, decrease the friction there. But I would say that is one of our bigger challenges.
Yeah, we run into that with research data as well. So one of the projects we run is the AMP-AD knowledge portal, and I think unlike a lot of the other AMP projects, AMP-AD is actually a cluster of 5 different projects with different sample sets and different data collection methodologies. And so we have this cluster of similar but not the same data. And actually, the knowledge portal is expanded, so it now is a place where data comes in from 5 different NIA-funded consortia. And again, same sort of thing, right? This is individual investigator-contributed data. And so how much work and where do you put the work into harmonizing across these things to make them maximally valuable to the researcher community versus say, hey, it's all here, so if there's some subset of this which helps you answer your question, you you are going to have to do some of this harmonization work as well. And so, we've taken a stance somewhere in the middle where we've taken the major human data sets and harmonized them, which was years and years of work. But we're leaving some of the other data sets that are either human samples, but one-off data modalities that we don't see consistently, or some of the animal studies, which are a little bit less harmonized. We just leave them alone and present them for people to use as they want. And it feels sort of unsatisfying, but also probably the best use of everybody's time.
So I have a comment about the platforms. You mentioned platforms to make data available. I think we have many different platforms already, and I'm not sure we should keep reinventing the platforms. I mean, what I'd like to see would be some effort across the platforms to harmonize maybe or set some core set of metadata which we could align on at least. I know it's difficult often because we have different modalities, different cohorts, different clinical outcomes and measures, but if there's a core set that we could potentially align on, I think that might facilitate better data sharing across the platforms for the researcher to perform the analysis.
Yeah, or at least data discovery, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would just love to hear some folks here. What are some of the barriers to doing that? I mean, I feel like I know a lot of the obvious ones. Everyone's got things to do, and it's hard enough to reach your objectives for any one organization on your own, and then you add in the tax of coordinating with other organizations with different agendas, and it just gets harder. So I think that obviously, especially with AMP80 and AMP-PD, different platforms, one's on one cloud, one's on another, to the degree at which we can let, as we were talking about before, where you can steer that through some scientific priorities that says, if we can only get access to this data in this way, that really is like probably the best way, but also, but it's also a difficult one because it bridges this kind of a science and computer science divide that often exists where those two communities aren't working together. So I'd love to get if anyone else has ideas or thoughts that are at least maybe a common understanding of some of the problems we're seeing, to see if there's opportunities to pick a few different projects and say, let's just get together and start working on it.
A throwdown, I love it. I think that the scientific use case approach is absolutely the best one, right? So with the AMP-AD and AMP-PD example, I think what initially happened was one of those projects was a target discovery project and one was a biomarker discovery project. So there wasn't a lot of value to either of them in sharing, but I think that they've both morphed into a little bit of both. So maybe now there's more opportunity. That might be one example. And then I would look for use cases other places, right? So we have a project with the Brain Commons, which is not about data discovery, but which is about using functionalities of two platforms of a common group of people. So we can look at interoperability there because it's valuable to both sides to get their work done. So it's about incentives, right?
Yeah.
Laura mentioned it and Lee, but I think the where to find the data is still a big problem. And even, I know there are a lot of platforms out there, but I think even just a list of the platforms, maybe there is that, but I think stuff like that would just be a great beginning. And it seems like it should be doable, right? I mean, you would know someone and you would know someone. How many platforms would you off the top of your head would say there are? So for sharing biomedical research data, just.
Well, when we started developing the Brain Commons, we did some due diligence. This is a few years ago, and we evaluated over 100 different platforms. Yep. So there's a lot.
Do you publish that, or is it?
No, we're putting together a white paper, so hopefully we could make that available at some point. Yeah.
And that's probably a couple of years old, so probably there's more platforms now. But
some may have gone, some new ones may have popped up.
Yeah. But even that. So how many were there?
We assessed around 100. Yeah. Both proprietary.
I would have thought 25. So it's interesting that there was 100.
This isn't just in the neuroscience space. This is more broadly, just platforms which allow data sharing and analysis. But there was a lot.
Biomedical,
Not necessarily, but they could host biomedical data. That was one of the requirements, yeah. But I think, as we saw the Google Docs earlier, perhaps we could do a Google Docs for platforms and data sets. I mean, that might be one step to enable researchers to find where data is.
And I think the Kavli group was trying to put together an index of all the funded projects that are coming out of the BRAIN initiative. So not just the US, but there's, I think, 7 other countries that have joined. And I don't know where they are with that. So that's just the BRAIN initiative stuff. But it just seems like, yeah, some kind of directory would be huge. What does, yeah, I mean, that, to me, the other thing is the preclinical data, I think, is also hugely valuable. And I know it's even more of the Wild West, but I think Rebecca's point about, like, do I need to do a new clinical trial or has it already been done? So I think I hear this from the people in therapy development that often they'll go down a road to, with a certain therapeutic in mind, and then later people will say, oh, yeah, we tried that too, but it didn't work, and we could have told you, or, so there's this whole sense of tons of stuff going on in even the earlier stage research that really could kind of inform other people if people could ever find it. But I know that's even a more complex.
Well, don't you think the requirements to register trials on clinicaltrials.gov and in the EU site, hasn't that taken care of that problem?
Well, I guess I was thinking more about the preclinical. People doing the animal work, that often leads to the clinical. And, so a lot of people will, a lot of good ideas kind of emerge together and people kind of run down those roads. But if it fails, it kind of just stays within their...
Preclinical testing, you mean? Yeah.
It kind of stays in their world, whereas if they could have said, oh, yeah, we tried. I mean, you hear this a lot with one of the basic science research, where people will try stuff and then, they compare notes later. But there's really no way. So we actually did try to do some of this for traumatic brain injury research, get some common data elements for the preclinical, and it was interesting. Those people also really want to be in the game. I mean, they are so much more sort of siloed than even the people in the clinical space. So it's a complicated question. It's not really the scope of this, but it's certainly worth, I think, considering.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question around platform or data discovery, right? I think you sort of indirectly hit on one of the problems, which is so much of this is funder-based. So you might get a directory, but it's only of things that a certain funder has looked at or in a certain country, right? And so what is the impetus to fund or initiate a project that goes beyond that, right? We all have to sort of think beyond that. And I also think that the technology companies can play a big role in this. Like Google has their Google data sets database, right? You can start to make these things more universally findable, independent of what platform they're in. And it seems like there's mechanisms that are coming up. I guess I don't know how successful they will or will not be, but that are starting to be a little bit more central.
Yeah, just to add to that, I guess I'm a little bit of when I hear the word platform, it means something very specific in my mind, and it usually means it's something through which other applications can be built on top of. And generally, like the Bill Gates line is, you have a platform when the aggregate value of all the applications built on top of you increases the value that platform itself captures in some capacity. So I think as I think about platforms, the degree at which the kind of the cloud infrastructure people, like the Google Clouds and AWSs and Microsofts, and I think we're seeing a huge investment by them in each of these areas because they see the business case for it, right? Storing and basically changing electricity, right, or selling electricity in forms that can store data and process it, they're figuring out. And they have the best incentive to think through some of the data sharing, discoverability, and data processing components. And it's probably actually left best to them because they have the staff, they can recruit and retain these people. So I think that as, I would say there's of the 100 platforms you looked at, I'm guessing there's probably a large percentage of them are actually just siloed tools that grew up around a specific problem that they set out to solve, and a problem that needed to be solved. And at some point, you have what I often see is like this first mover disadvantage, where someone builds a tool and then it's hard to maintain that. And in a world where there's new things happening, especially in software, where like every 6 months or 12 months, there's a new project and that gets started, and it's starting a year ahead of where someone else did, so they can do more faster. So there's this complexity in the tools ecosystem that's very hard to navigate. And we're all in the middle of it. I feel like you fast forward 20 years, a lot of stuff will be settled and be done, but we're not there yet. So it's hard for people to pick tools and platforms right now, especially when you have scientific questions that need to be answered right now. No one wants to wait another day or a week or a year for a Google or an Amazon to come up with a standard for processing things. So we're left with these hard choices about to spend today's money on something that may not be sustainable, and we're not budgeting for the transition from whatever we wrote into something better. And we have to deal with, again, that first mover disadvantage of having paid for something that we have to manage and maintain. So I think those are some of the hard parts in here. And I think just being more open about where we've invested in technology that we feel like should probably end of life, and working together to kill that thing, and then moving on to the next. And that does require people to lose some of the emotional attachment they have to parts of the things that they have built, which is very hard. I've done this. I've had to go through this myself, where you feel like it takes a lot of work to build something, to write software. But then you have to answer that question, like, okay, there's parts of that we need to change. And I guess I'll say that in the sense that like a lot of the work that Verily is doing with the Broad, taking their FireCloud, parts of their FireCloud infrastructure and changing into something we're calling Terra, is forcing us to make a lot of decisions about what parts of that stack, so what parts of that solution do we want to unbundle and say this piece is no longer doing its job, and we want someone else to do that for us, so we could focus on something else. And I think that's where it's through initiatives like the Data Biosphere, a lot of the Data Commons work. We just have to keep that conversation going, because I think the folks who have software expertise have a responsibility to take that burden on, so that the scientists could actually get to work. So sorry, that was a long bit of a ramble there on some of the platforms and the tools, but I think that's where we are, is that we're in the middle of this change, and this is a generational change, not just one that's like an iPhone upgrade away from getting it all right.
And I think that one of the dichotomies that I'm struggling with is, are the data the currency, or are the platforms the currency?
It's definitely not the platforms. Like these are just software. It'll be replaced. It'll all be different in 3 or 4 years.
And so then curating the data in real time for the clinical trial should become a huge priority in a way that's universally accessible.
Correct. Yeah, I think data has to be like, we have to turn that into information, right? And that requires a few different transformations that are not obvious or known at the time we're even collecting the data. And the tools to transform that data just are constantly being kind of improved and being changed as well.
That's a great point. Thank you. So I'm going to end the session now. We have to be back in here in 1 minute for the next session. So thank you, everybody, for your participation.